in this lecture series, Cities in the World. Jade Mandrake is our guest today, and we have also Francesca Ranalli, which is the lecturer for tomorrow. Today, Jade Mandrake is going to talk about New York, and Francesca Ranalli about Amsterdam. If I well understood, you are working together in a research program. So it should be interesting to see how an architect and artist from Italy and New York City, they work together. So Jade, thank you again for being here. Just a few words to say that this lecture series is about cities. And I launched with Valentina this program last year because we were totally in distant learning. So the idea was to let the student travel around the world, staying at home. So I invited people to come and talk about many cities in the world, USA, Asia, Emirates, and Europe, of course. So this is the second edition of this lecture series, and I'm very happy to have you because you are not an architect, so this is interesting for us, and also you are telling something about New York City, which is, of course, a very interesting city. So a few words for introduction. Jade Mandrake is a multimedia artist and researcher born and raised in New York City. Working in stained glass, audio, video, photography, narrative, and more. Since 2019, she explores interdisciplinary research methods for urban planning that moves toward an international open-ended model for commoning. So this is interesting for us as urban planners and urban designers to see the approach of an artist. And she presents her work at university and galleries, private residences, and public-facing venues in New York and abroad. And she works on the nature-culture continuum as it relates to the desire for self-actualization features as a primary mode of knowledge production as part of her larger project of artistic research with hermetic architecture. Sounds good. So, Jade, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you. It's great to be here. All right, I'm going to share my screen. New York, New York. Waking in the nature culture city. This presentation is an invitation to wake. Wake to a city that was born, like the mythological Hermes, flying between worlds and bringing the knowledge that the worlds are ultimately one. Hermes, alternatively known as Coyote in Native American myth, darts and flies between the constructed boundaries of nature and culture, between the material and the immaterial worlds, so that what is always already existing becomes more conscious of itself. In this presentation, I draw on Donna Haraway's concept of nature culture to describe both nature and culture as on a co-creative continuum that is already embedded within capitalist ontology. I dialogue nature culture with the city of New York, a quintessential capitalist global city, born as an experiment and with a life of its own. One whose origins in Amsterdam and whose emergence was brutally founded on the island home to the Lenape, helped to reveal a parallax view that I suggest is essential to thinking possible futures. The concept of nature culture is often invoked as a turn away from modernity, whose capitalist ideology of exploitation, its obsession with growth, and allegiance to survival of the fittest is widely understood as generating ecological and social crises around the world. Nature culture, as it is commonly engaged, instead promotes the decentering of the human, a move aimed at countering anthropocentrism, what is entangled with the rise of capitalism since the European Enlightenment. a position that critical theory sees at the root of capitalist destructiveness. Like Alice poised to enter through the looking glass illustrated here, I will show that New York, as an extension of its Hermetic roots in Europe, which were themselves established by global flows of knowledge, embodies the Hermetic ontology and suggests nature-culture be rethought, not merely as a turn away from modernity, but as a deepening of modernity toward self-awareness. Self-awareness capable of fostering an ethics of responsibility for the other, human and non-human, in the pursuit of personal transformation. I begin in Amsterdam, whose likeness it constructed on the island of Manhattan in the early 17th century, calling it then New Amsterdam. This initial part of the presentation establishes the roots of New York and is essential to inspecting its branches and leaves in the coming section, approaching then its ontology. It was in Amsterdam that I conducted extensive research into the Hermetic origins of global capitalism, which was a byproduct of examining its monumental capitalist material culture on the terms that it set. After exploring some of the ways in which I am thinking New York in a process of waking to its nature-culture ontology, I will finish with an introduction to the project I am working on with Francesca Rinaldi, who will be presenting here tomorrow, of commenting with youth through art and nature. In this project, we use insights gained from this interdisciplinary research to help establish a toolkit for commenting that is both adaptable and replicable from the bottom up and on an international scale. The blue hour. The period of twilight when the sun is a significant depth below the horizon, and where the remaining sunlight takes on a blue shade. The period just before sunrise, just before but entangled with waking. The monumental building that I dialogued with in Amsterdam, het Scheepvaarthuis, or the shipping house, was a joint headquarters for 6 leading shipping companies in the early 20th century. The building, where patrons could purchase tickets aboard steamships and ship and receive goods from around the globe, was a political move just before the First World War, facilitating not only cohesion for the corporate state alliance of the Netherlands, continuing its legacy as a corporate state since the VOC, but also foregrounding the expansion of global capitalism as an imperial pursuit that relies upon public, cultural, and material consumption, trade, and travel. The building, as a crucial object of material culture in the global capitalist archive, speaks to the importance of its genealogical inclusion in discourse around its imperial imaginary, necessary to offering meaningful alternatives. To engage the shipping house, I conducted historical research in a very specific way. I began by following the genealogical method of Michel Foucault qua Nietzsche, committed to rooting up hidden or neglected historical artifacts, and I did this by using object analysis of capitalist monumental architecture. Foucault writes that, quote, history becomes effective to the degree that it introduces discontinuity into our being, end quote, to the extent that it alters the selective arrangement of content that attempt to shape its form. The shipping house introduces such discontinuity and disturbs seemingly fixed conceptions about global capitalism as having an exclusive focus on scientific rationalism, secularism, and Protestant-derived ethics to which critical discourse counters. To this end, I pushed the limits of Foucault's genealogical project by incorporating the specific mode of object analysis developed by the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, ASCA, in which the object has epistemic authority and thus directed the Foucauldian genealogy. My engagement with the shipping house responds to the call for novel solutions to what appears an apocalyptic end from ongoing ecologically destructive global capitalist practices, much of which have fallen within the purview of the humanities and social sciences to solve. What was revealed during this process were what I call the undercurrents of global capitalism, due to their concealed but pervasive existence across the span of, but not limited to, the capitalist empire. and so this charted my course, which led me then back to New York. But first, more on its origins, what I am calling the blue hour, the hour of twilight just before and leading to the sunrise. Here you see a map of Amsterdam in the 17th century and its likeness, constructed here on Manhattan, Lenape for the Island of Many Hills, and its rendering in a map of what was called New Amsterdam in 1660, what would later be renamed New York. To continue our exploration into the blue hour, I will explain a bit more about what Hermeticism is, and thus how it informs my present work conceiving of New York as a nature-culture city to be woken to. Here again you see a photo of the shipping house, built in the likeness of a ship between 1913 and 1916 at the eve of the First World War, and whose second phase was completed from 1926 to 1928. Spanning the area of a full block on what was the harbor of the Eye in the late 16th century, the building was ritualistically erected in the exact location that Cornelius Houtman set out to discover a new trade route to the Indies. What began what is now known as the Dutch Golden Age, an age marked by brutality, enslavement, theft, and death of indigenous people around the world. The building is covered in decorative symbols inside and out. Some examples are shown here. Its expressionistic character is attributed to a collaboration of architects, company directors, sculptors, and interior designers, each of them working toward a global vision that incorporated both elements of competition and cooperation. To be sure, this building was constructed at a time when socialist principles were being actively pursued in relation to social housing in Amsterdam. This was a direct result of the rise in industry under capitalism and the influx of masses from rural settings into urban centers. The shipping house, with an enormous effectual presence and covered in decadent, expressionistic, and symbolic ornamentation, is also considered the first true example of the Amsterdam School, what can be regarded as the Dutch version of Art Deco, a Gesamtkunstwerk, or total work of art, whose emphasis is equally co-created by socialist and capitalist aims. Indeed, the rise of one depended on the health of the other. As I set out to take this object on its own terms, it therefore required that I initiate myself into and speak in its language in order to create discourse. Upon initiation, I found that its language, being hermetic, required combining rational and non-rational dialogic methods. In doing so, I gained insight not only into the historical, hermetic context of global capitalism and its active relation with nature, as well as its entanglement with socialism, but it inspired a deeply personal reflection of both myself and the ideology silently underwriting New York City, the city in which I was born and raised. This figure on the exterior facade is the namesake of Hermeticism, Hermes Trismegistus, as he was called during the ancient Greek Empire, and whose name was Thoth in ancient Egypt. Hermes is the god of trade, the arts, medicine, mathematics, music, and more. The god that flies between worlds, leading individuals in their quest to become gods themselves, leading them to gnosis, a state of enlightenment achieved as one becomes united with the primary sun god and remembers the divine spark, always already within the self. Therefore, the process that Hermes sponsors is one of deification, but also of resurrection. It is a rebirth, requiring death to the illusion of separation from the primary source of life. Historically, Hermeticism is a body of knowledge that is derived at least from ancient Egypt, but whose texts themselves claim to have been brought over from the lost continent of Atlantis. Hermeticism guides by numerous means, intellectual, affectual, material, immaterial, through trade, often entangled with theft and trickery, or alternately with love and communion. It promotes a direct communication with God, and so entangles itself also with Protestantism. As the self is co-creator with the divine, a deeply personal and open-ended process has resulted in numerous related spiritual currents, a process inhering in the natural world of constantly expanding diversification and unfoldment. It is a nature-culture hermeneutic. Here you can see a fragment of the bus lining the perimeter of the building. Styled like chess pieces and masts of the ship, cartographers, major generals, merchants, and captains announce the entanglement of rational scientific linear and non-rational mythological thought. Accordingly, I used a combination of rational and non-rational research methods to engage it. Drawing on feminist scientist and scholar Karen Barad, this hermetic approach is conversant with intra-action, her term describing when two subjects co-create each other through their encounter, and therefore become ontologically altered. Translating this concept of co-constitutionality of material and immaterial relations, Barad builds upon the famous light wave particle experiment that pioneered insights in quantum mechanics. Rather than taking a more rote, critical approach to capitalism, my research examines our differences using this feminist approach for what is shared within those differences. Interestingly, interaction is central to one of the key components in Hermetic thought, alchemy, symbolized by the caduceus, or wand that Hermes holds in his hands. The symbol of the caduceus visualizes the co-creative and ongoing production between seeming opposites emotions, producing a third form of life as a result, containing still parts of the former, and after which it splits into two, and so on. From the spiritual alchemical perspective, it is this process that leads one to rebirth. Here you can see again the image of Hermes on the shipping house and the caduceus he is holding. As Barad reveals this co-creative capacity by way of observations of nature, in that case at the level of quantum physics, so is the gravity of Hermeticism as a nature-culture system all the more apparent. In alchemy, time is both linear and nonlinear. From a linear perspective, there are three stages, all symbolized by the caduceus, the first being chaos, the second division, and the third synthesis, reproduced in continuous cycles. From a nonlinear perspective, there is only one eternal moment, as perceived in the symbolic form. The alchemical creative process is central to my research of Waking to New York because it is both hermetic, that is, in the language of capitalist ontology in which the city is an extension, and it is conversant with Baradian interaction in which the specific ways the process is experienced becomes paramount to what is created as a result. Engaging the arts together with Foucauldian-style historical research, I follow a non-rational vision that emerged for me during my time spent with the building. I conceive of myself as lute in a still life, an angel, fallen and felled, and in the process of waking from and in the stillness. I materialize the vision by recreating the still life as I saw it in my mind's eye and climbing into it. I set up a camera, and using a remote control, I maintained continuous, spontaneous movement of my body while shooting stills. In the thresholds of stillness and movement, of participation and receptivity, of my imagination and of materiality, I interact with the vision, and what results in the photos, what appears spontaneously, becomes my measuring device. This resulted in a long reel of photos in which key frames emerged. They were key because they spoke in the Hermetic language, communicating in the void of silence and producing new entangled motifs. The figure that emerged in this photo recalls the Sphinx's Neptune and Salacia at the top of the shipping house. The flowers between my legs, both dead, not dead, claiming the foreground. The background recedes and my head disappears. In its place, a winged creature invoking Thoth, whose head is of a bird, but also the alchemical process pictured in the caduceus, and whose entwined snakes, as my arms entwine, create a winged head to the staff. The divine spark of the sun within invoked here as transforming to a state of unification with the whole. New York is the quintessential global city experiment, an empire city of global capitalism, or as Rem Koolhaas famously describes it in his text Delirious New York, quote, an accumulation of possible disasters that never happen, end quote. Indeed, there is a sort of equilibrium in the chaos of New York. Through all the division created by competition, again there is synthesis, followed by chaos again, and so on. The city embodies the alchemical cycle, this nature culture, as its texture. Eric Sanderson, in his detailed recreation of the island before the arrival of the Dutch, writes that, quote, the landscape that Hudson discovered for Europe that day was prodigious in its abundance, resplendent in its diversity, a place richer than many people today imagine could exist anywhere. If Mannahatta existed today as it did then, it would be a national park. It would be the crowning glory of American national parks. Mannahatta had more ecological communities per acre than Yellowstone, more native plant species per acre than Yosemite, and more birds than the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Mannahatta housed wolves, black bears, mountain lions, beavers, mink, and river otters. Whales, porpoises, seals, and the occasional sea turtle visited its harbor, end quote. Sanderson continues, extraordinary cultural diversity has replaced extraordinary biodiversity in the island. Today, people from nearly every nation on earth can be found living in New York City. It is a conceit of New York City, Sanderson writes, to think it is a place outside of nature, a place where humanity has completely triumphed over the forces of the natural world, where a person can do and be anything without limit or consequence. Yet this conceit is not unique to the city. It is shared by a globalized 21st century human culture, which posits that through technology and economic development, we can escape the shackles that bind us to our earthly selves. As such, the story of Mannahatta's transformation to Manhattan isn't localized to one island. It is a coming-of-age story that literally embraces the entire world and is relevant to all of the 6.7 billion human beings who share it. End quote. Understanding the hermetic undercurrents of New York City attends to Sanderson's calls for ecological responsibility by bringing into the fold the collective issue of personal striving and development and its role in the natural world. The people of the island for 4 centuries when the Dutch arrived were the Lenape, a mobile people that hunted, fished, and planted according to the seasons, and who had settlements around the island. Above you can see, in addition to an early drawing of a Lenape man, 2 masks used in religious ceremonies as well as present-day Lenape below, gathering for political, social, and cultural customs. The Lenape were a deeply religious people when the Dutch arrived, and their myth of creation is much like the myth of creation in Hermeticism. For the Lenape, nature as such could not be thought apart from what animates it, the spiritual, energetic forces that quite literally matter. Though the details differ, both the Lenape and Hermeticists tell of the void before the primary God envisioned earth and then created it. They speak of an event taking place in which humans would fight over the temptation of power and the fracture of a single language, of a great flood and the gathering of animals together on a boat, what for the Lenape was a turtle's back, of the ways in which human beings would continue to be splintered against each other, and then how they could become one again with the help of the primary god, whom they referred to as Keshelamukam. As in Amsterdam with the shipping house, what was, as I mentioned, the first example of the Amsterdam school, I turned to Art Deco architecture in New York City as one of the dialogic methods that can be used to wake to the city's nature-culture ontology. The Empire State Building is one that signals the architecture of diversity in New York City. Constructed in 1929 and beating the Chrysler Building as the tallest building of the time, it stands out from many of the other more decadent and expressionistic examples of Art Deco, while simultaneously embodying a more anonymous and fluid diversity central to the capitalist empire. It was meant not to represent a single industry, as for instance the Chrysler Building was, but whose interiors were to be rented. The symbol of empire signals in this way the architecture of nature culture, a stillness to its construction, characterized by its cleaner lines and less ornamentation on the outside. The building is nevertheless teeming with movement and change on its interior. This relief sculpture in the building's interior lobby reveals the Empire State shining its rays down around it. The sculpture blurs the boundaries between materiality and spiritual awakening, remembering that the ultimate good, as Hermes wrote, is to be made a god oneself through unification with the primary sun god. The material world, as for the Lenape, cannot be thought apart from the spiritual animating it, and it was this spiritual regard for nature that characterized the texture, customs, rituals, and relations that create its culture. The Empire State Building asks us to approach the adaptability and flexibility of capitalism as an example of a nature culture that in turn constitutes its stability. Materializing the spiritual undercurrent, the building suggests the interaction between the material and the spiritual is paramount to its functioning. Gazing down from its rooftop, one can both feel and imagine an exalted state of being. As Hermes writes, as above, so below, to indicate the blurring boundaries of the spiritual and material worlds, so the visitor of the Empire State Building casts their attention beneath them to what appears as a sea of stars, glittering. Some of the particular, more personal dialogues within the nature culture city are operative in the buildings designed for a specific industry. The former RCA quarters, turned General Electric building at 570 Lexington Avenue, is one such example, personifying radio waves and electrical currents. Though personification is often pointed to as evidence of anthropocentrism in critical discourse and thus outside of a nature culture alternative, the Gothic stylization of the building, blending with personified energy forms, suggests not only the treatment of non-humans as persons, but a trans-temporal and spiritual dimension. Stepping outside of so-called Western conceptions of personification, I recall here the anthropologist Eduardo Viveros de Castro reflecting on the personifying practices of some of the Amerindian tribal cultures. For de Castro, personification is engaged by Amerindian shamans to continuously multiply rather than reflect the self. This Amerindian practice, referred to as perspectivism, requires that non-humans be conceived of as persons. For de Castro writes, quote, "One must know how to personify, because one must personify to know." De Castro continues, "By seeing non-human beings as they see themselves, shamans become capable of playing the role of active interlocutors in the trans-specific dialogue." While de Castro points to this as evidence that Amerindian shamanism is, quote, "diametrically opposed to objectivist epistemology encouraged by Western modernity," end quote, the the material culture evidenced by Western modernity suggests an almost shamanic engagement with that which it consumes. Because my research shows that Hermeticism is deeply woven into global capitalist empire, such a moment of expression in the period of Art Deco communicates that the blurring of these boundaries should be not thought as merely decorative. In the Hermetic language, nature culture can be thought usefully through the alchemical cycle. The objectifying gaze of the researcher, conflated in approach with the Western capitalist empire, is here suggested as one stage in the alchemical cycle, which is constantly in motion. The final stage of synthesis recognizes the unity of all things, and therefore evades the grasp even of critical discourse aimed at an egalitarian politics, as it once doubles as chaos, alternatively understood as the void. From this perspective, the stage of synthesis invokes the Amerindian aim of perspectivism as the multiplying of the self. In this stage, for Hermeticists as Amerindian shamans, everything is permeated with the light of God. And like the shamans, the God state achieved by perspective-generated synthesis enables an ongoing, plural reading of the world, rather than a fixed one. As Hermetic scholar Antoine Favre writes, a Hermesian reading of the world is necessarily a plural reading. The American dream, epitomized in New York City, is a city of ongoing plurality. As a nature culture city, this plurality is not static. It alchemically unfolds, splits, synthesizes, and splits again in a constant flow of change. In this way, I suggest that New York itself is an alchemical symbol to be stepped into, and like all symbols, requires both participation and stillness to decipher. Perspectivism. Consider how close the forces of social, cultural, political, and material life interact with each other to co-create the city, and in doing so, agitate the spiritual undercurrents to the surface. In this slide, the skyscraper, New York's most recognizable symbol, bears a striking resemblance to the Mayan temple. The stepped design of the skyscraper was due to the 1916 zoning regulation in New York City, which argued for equitable access to air and light, otherwise monopolized by the skyscraper. Nature culture at work, the emergence of the skyscraper as individualistic upward striving, and the pushback amongst the public for equitable access reveals the interplay, or rather, to use Karen Barad's term, interaction between the individual and the collective that has given shape to the modern skyscraper and speaks to a universal desire for light and air. A direct consequence of congestion, what Rem Koolhaas described as key to his Manifesto of Manhattan, the 1916 zoning regulation reveals the self-ordering architecture manifest in the nature culture city. Stopping to consider further the formative power of congestion, or chaos, here you can see a picture of the Fiat Lux, in which Hermes describes the introduction of light, that is to say, creation, into the void/chaos. The flows of rationality and what Koolhaas describes as irrationality are not an obsession with artificial environment building per se or anti-nature, but two co-creating aspects of nature which can take the form of a people-made metropolis. Therefore, while Koolhaas renders the city as having almost entirely removed itself from nature by way of irrational and fantastic, I suggest it has been forming actively with natural principles of creation. While criticisms of Koolhaas ironically point out that his vision of New York as a, quote, condition before being a place, end quote, orients it with a bourgeois idea of inevitability, I am suggesting here that it does in fact operate within and of the inevitability of nature, but it necessarily without allegiance to the specific manifestations of any given form. Its strength and its inevitability lie in its change. Congestion, chaos, void are one feature of the city related to personal transformation.
What will I do? Don't let me get away! To their head! Still lost, no? But the Queen, I simply must get out. But you are outside. What? See for yourself. Why, that's me. I'm asleep. Don't let me get away. Alice, wake up. Please wake up, Alice. Alice. Please wake up, Alice. 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 Alice.
To skip the process of self-seeking in discourse of nature culture is to remain illiterate to the capitalist empire, whose adaptability and resilience can be readily traced to capitalizing on these processes. It is also, therefore, to remain blind to the symbol of New York City as the Empire State. To wake to this aspect of nature and conceive of the ways in which it is always already embedded in culture is to engage in the process of one's journey, and in doing so claim direct contact with one's own personal ascension or return to the true self, which appears to have been temporarily lost. It is to build on David Harvey's interpretation of the right to the city. It is more than access to resources. It's about the right for personal transformation in and of the city, an individual rite of passage that occurs paradoxically through the collective. Upon this waking, New York reveals itself as a symbolic device. For the Lenape, personal transformation, a key component to discovering one's special role in the collective, involved a vision quest for young people between the ages of 12 and 14. New York, embodying the nature-culture ontology of its roots, acts as a kind of forest upon which a vision quest takes place. A conscious engagement with such a quest invokes deeply personal questions of responsibility and to where one's allegiance falls. Within and behind the changes and diversification, who am I? It is the primordial state of becoming that encompasses all time. Consider these words of musician and poet Patti Smith. Quote, New York is the thing that seduced me. New York is the thing that formed me. New York is the thing that deformed me. New York is the thing that perverted me. New York is the thing that converted me. And New York is the thing that I love, too. Turning again to Viveros de Castro, this time to his observations of the ritual masks worn during Carnival in his essay, The Equal and the Different, I zero in on the phenomenon of concealment and revelation of the individual in relation to the society, within what appears as chaos. Like de Castro's observations of Carnival, whose image you see on the right, Times Square on the left as a Debordian spectacle, chaos, or as Kohlhaas refers to it, congestion of the city is itself, I suggest, a continuous ritual moment in which the relation of the individual to the society is emphasized, brought into relief, aggravated, and then dissolved. De Castro writes, quote, the behavioral changes instantiated by Carnival accompany changes in the actual experience of the self, in the conception of person, of individuality, and in the experience of group participation. It is the experience of the fantasia, in the double sense, that defines Carnival, implying simultaneously the concealing and revelation of individuality. End quote. It is the seeming chaos that gives rise, like the first alchemical stage, to the second, stimulating individuation. Indeed, the more one gives in to its generalized anonymity, the more one may assume a character or mask, experiencing the double encounter of defining and finally dissolving the self, a move that inevitably gravitates towards synthesis or silence. Carnival, like New York, hosts an open-ended multiplicity of characters one may assume and encounter, and in doing so reveals the choice made by the participant while simultaneously concealing it. In thinking global cities as equitable, as reparative, healthy, and sustainable, I argue that urban design must think in terms of nature culture and utilize the nature culture city of New York for a process of rising consciousness. These two aspects are intertwined and co-creating. The texture is defined by the level of consciousness, and consciousness defines the texture one creates in return. On this perspective, it is the measuring device that co-creates with the object of the city. To which New York seems to answer, it is by attending to the self-actualizing impulse in terms of nature culture, that which takes the uniqueness of each individual seriously, that gives the city a texture that is both sustainable and prepared to respond to the more than human. To do this folds back into capitalism, with its emphasis on progress, invention, and entrepreneurship, but wakes to the ecology it is a part of and thus transforms it as a result into something new. As a sort of companion species, I have demonstrated that hermetically informed buildings are part of our nature culture experience, congealed into a single moment for inspection, reflection, inspiration. Commenting from this lens is the parallax view of the undercurrents to capitalism, whose pyramidal structure spins to reflect in every direction when the personal experience of it is acknowledged. The entanglement of individual success and cooperation is what is at stake in a nature culture city that works and can be sustained. From a nature culture view, a move from one side to the other is not sustainable because it reproduces but one stage, the stage of division, even when it aims towards synthesis. The golden hour, also called the magic hour, is the time of day just after sunrise that is softer, more red, and the brightness of the sky matches the brightness of the city, the street lights, the signs, car headlights, and lighted windows. So how to explore these ideas on a practical level? In a project initiated by Francesca Rinaldi, I began exploring with her the idea of commenting through the eyes of children in Almere Port, the Netherlands. In this project, ethnographic and arts-based workshops were used as a means for the children to open up and explore their thoughts, feelings, and desires for their neighborhoods and to foster a sense of belonging. Through an object analysis, in the mode of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis that I described earlier, we learned that children in this age range were in a critical period of adapting to the established societal frame, meaning that tasked with designing the neighborhood, they tended toward rehearsing more or less already existing infrastructure. However, we also witnessed the artistic process enabling the creative deviations from this frame, which, from the perspective of nature culture, are essential to both the personal process of development and the stability of the collective. Building on the lessons we learned in this project, and focusing on the critical age range of 13 to 17, when young people more often than not do not have a space of their own with which to develop their personhood, we are now working toward an international model for commenting from the bottom up that further integrates the explorations I have made today of waking to the nature culture city and its symbolic mattering within the global city of New York. Cycles of chaos, individuation, and stillness will be devices by which the young people can actively and creatively engage their processes of transformation in and with their visions for the city. I have tried to lay a basic framework here by engaging with different thinkers, but as an inherently diversifying and deeply personal process, it is through bottom-up participation with urban residents that this research will become fully operative. The international project will begin in the spring of 2022 with a podcast as well as a panel discussion involving the young people, researchers, policymakers, urban planners, and artists to discuss the process and productions of the young people and implications for building sustainable cities.
Yeah, very exciting and quite complex, let me say, because your thought is very, it's a palimpsest, so many layers of culture and history and sociologism. So it's a rich vision. So thank you for this this richness of thought. So now it's time for my students to do a short presentation regarding New York. And soon after, Jade, we will open a discussion, which will be led by my students, and of course, also me and Francesca. Francesca, you're welcome to discuss more in deepness this work. I have many questions that I would try to ask and to focus on, but it was not easy for me to follow entirely because of a little bit the language, because you speak, of course, a little bit fast, and also for the disconnection that I had during today. It's very bad weather here in Pescara. It's raining, and maybe I had some disconnections. And anyway, I have quite points to discuss regarding your presentation. But we will do it soon after the presentation of my students. So please, Angelica Di Febo, Camille Durand-Reville, and Akram